Well, we are joined by Professor Ciaran Brady, Professor of Early Modern History and Historiography. Ciaran, thanks a million for joining us.
Pleasure.
So we're here to talk about, I suppose, historiography, history writing, the writing of history. And for this particular course on Ireland in rebellion, I'd like to ask you, how have historians of Ireland viewed all of these rebellions?
Well, it depends where you start. To begin with, those who would be recognisable today as historians in the 19th century, I mean people like Lecky and Froude, took in a way opposite views about the significance of rebellions, but largely were on the same side. So Lecky saw rebellions as really the symptoms of the failure of good English government in Ireland. It should have been better. Had it been better, these things wouldn't have happened. And although Lecky and Froude hated one another, or Lecky hated Froude, frankly, Froude took the view that it's a sign of the failure of English government not to be strong enough. The important thing is to have more English rule, not less of it. Now, they're the ones who were on one side, and as I say, they're the ones who were writing history books. But what's really interesting is at the same time, there was an emergence and a rapid emergence of an alternative view amongst Irish nationalists who weren't writing recognisable history books, but were still writing history, who said rebellion is part of an Irish tradition. And what you see taking place in the later 19th century is the gradual moving away from the idea of rebellion to the idea of rising. Now, what really strikes me as interesting here, and I think the Fenians are terribly important in this, is that where people in the past had spoken of the 1641 rebellion, the 1798 rebellion, what you get taking place in the later 19th century is the removal of that notion from rebellion to rising. Think about how we refer to 1916. It's the 1916 rising. It's the rising. And you have songs like The Rising of the Moon, which refer back to 1798. And I think this introduction of a new term, not rebellion, rising, introduces implicitly a new interpretation of Irish history, which is that we are always rising. And there's a kind of teleological drive in this. We are going to be free. The phoenix is going to rise again. And it's interesting, the Fenians speak about the rising, and the Fenians started with the Phoenix Clubs. And it is the phoenix that is going to rise out of the ashes of defeat. So you get a kind of peculiar inverted Whiggism in Irish nationalist history writing, which is that although one failed rebellion follows on another failed rebellion, actually they're part of a process of repeated risings, which are sooner or later going to issue in true freedom. And of course, that's what the 1916 rising does in this historical mythology.
Yeah, it says 6 times in the past 300 years.
Yes.
So it draws this explicit link, as you say. This has been a process, and now we've emerged to the end of this process, victory in 1916.
That's right. But of course, only long after 1916 itself. But looked back retrospectively, they all are part of this accumulation to the phoenix rising again from the ashes of defeat until sooner or later, and now we're going to win.
So what about the two traditions that emerged then, the constitutional nationalist tradition and the revolutionary republican violent tradition? Did historians play into those narratives, or were they aware of them, or how did they address them?
Oh, very much they were. And more than that, I'd say that it's an historian's construct. Because if we look at this, here we have, say, a 19th century backdrop where you have the recognisable historians deploring rebellion, no matter what explanation they give for its causes. The non-historians who are still writing history saying, aha, it is part of this phoenix flame that's going on. But with the establishment of independence, then the historians in the universities have to navigate their way, negotiate through this. And what they do is devise, and you can identify this with people like Dudley Edwards in UCD and C.O. Moody, T.W. Moody in Trinity College Dublin, is developed this notion of two traditions in Irish history. There is, they say, the physical force tradition, and there is, on the other hand, the constitutional movement. And Irish history can be seen as a kind of oscillation between these two polarities. And so, if you like, you can trace the physical force tradition, if you want to go back that far, to Owen Roe O'Neill in the 17th century, to Wolfe Tone in the 18th century, to Robert Emmet in the early 19th century, to the Fenians, and so on. And then, of course, to the IRB and 1916. But all the time, acting as a kind of contrapuntal effort in regard to these, there are those who are moving for constitutionalism. So, before Tone, we have Grattan and all the possibilities that might have been there. After Emmet, we have O'Connell and all the possibilities for repeal that might have been there had there not been terrible events at Clontarf, and then, of course, the famine. And after the Fenians, we have Isaac Butt, actually, and then Charles Stewart Parnell, and then we have the Independent Irish Party and Home Rule. And then, of course, at the end, we have this wonderful convergence of physical force, embodied by that great leader of the war, Michael Collins, who signs a treaty, who signs up for the constitutional says solution to things. And that seemed to me to be, for the historians, a very convenient way of packaging Irish history that recognised these two very, very strong polarities, but said they can come together. And they did come together in the end. So just as you had the teleology of the Phoenix Flame issuing in independence in the War of Independence, so also the two traditions come together in the form of Michael Collins and Arthur Griffin and W.T. Cosgrave, and everybody could then settle down again. So the suggestion is that they were knitted together. I think there are ambiguities in that. I think there are contradictions in that, which the historians didn't like to explore all that much. And
is that an example then of historians writing the history of the past in the context of present-day events and allowing that to shape the narrative?
Oh, I think so. And I think they did that under pressure of current events and in a way under current frameworks. And the big framework here is partition. So what they were able to do is say, well, look, physical force got us so far, but really constitutionalism is the thing that got us to the place where we are now. There is this kind of ambiguity that's there all the time. Thus, we interpret people like Owen Roe O'Neill or Wolfe Tone as constitutionalists, don't you know, who were forced by pressure from outside, usually the English or the British, into violent positions. So you have somebody like Robert Emmet, who would have been a good constitutionalist except for the horrific repressions of post-Union Ireland. Then we have O'Connell, who withstands the pressure to be violent and therefore a model for us all. There is the Fenians, who were too radical, went too far to the side and got us nothing. But then there's Parnell, who knew how to contain violence. And one of the central events in this historiographical account of how the constitutional movement developed, the new departure in Irish politics when Parnell sat down with the Fenians, represented by Davitt and so on, and made his peace with them, and they accepted his leadership. So it's no accident, it seems to me, that in the historiography of mid to late 20th century Ireland, Parnell features so centrally, and something like the new departure is such an important event in it. And then that leads on, of course, to, oh yes, another frustration for constitutionalism, which leads to a kind of explosion of frustration in 1916. But we have another new departure in the form of the treaty, in the form of the acceptance of partitioned Ireland.
Earlier you mentioned T.W. Moody and Dudley Edwards, and they, with the Irish Historical Society, Irish Historical Studies, tried to, I suppose, develop a more objective approach to history writing. And then you had, in the late 20th century, debates in Ireland about revisionism.
Yes.
And I think a lot of our students on this course maybe won't understand revisionism in the Irish context, that certain historians were denounced as being revisionist because they weren't going along with an heroic Irish nationalist interpretation. They were questioning some established. Can you tell us maybe something about those debates?
Yes, indeed. But before I do, can I say something about, you mentioned Dudley Edwards and Theo Moody. What the two of them did in the 1930s was effectively set up a framework for historical study and for the expression, the publication of historical studies and the propagation of historical research that accepted partition. What they were doing was saying, look, we'll have an Ulster Historical Society and an Irish Historical Society for the Free State and then for the Republic of Ireland, but we will accept the status quo as established by the treaty and by the Government of Ireland Act. And in that sense, they wished to exclude from consideration and debate whether the whole partition of the island was right in the first place or not. Which meant this, that they tended to emphasize in their setting out of research agendas, and they were excellent at doing that, one agenda after another of what research should be done and so on, not the immediate context of partition, but what was happening in the 19th century and the 18th century. And the dominant motifs here was, how did the constitutional movement alternate with the physical force movement? What caused it to happen and what caused it to come back again? So that's the way they were doing things. And to be fair, between about the 1940s and the late 1960s, they produced, under their aegis, a very large body of standard academic research, which could stand, its credibility against anything that was being produced elsewhere. And that's miles away from the kind of polemical history writing that I was talking about earlier, with Lecky and Froude on the one side, or nationalist historians like John Mitchell on the other. Here they were creating a framework in which those of a unionist disposition in Northern Ireland, those of a nationalist position in the Free State or Republic of Ireland, could actually talk the same talk and could actually come together and discuss historical events in a somewhat objective nature. I wouldn't want to say that Moody or Edwards actually believed innocently in the idea of objective history. They believed in the toxic nature of subjective history and thought the idea was to move as far away as possible from that. But I think neither of them were as philosophically unsophisticated as to think you can actually speak in a scientific, objective way about Irish history. Nevertheless, the problem that arose is that the very discipline that they imposed on both themselves and on those who studied with them. You don't express sentiments. You don't express your personal opinions about things. You stick to what the facts say. You don't put in adjectives and adverbs when they are not necessary at all. Tended to create the impression that these were historians who didn't care about history, and that Irish history really was something from which they were detached. Add to that a cleverness, a delight in words that some of the best practitioners of this generation of historians, I wouldn't call them a school, by the way, but just generation of historians, and this joy in being able to treat the dire events of Irish history with a distance could also create the impression that they weren't sympathetic to their own history. Now, it seems to me that that was always there, simmering in the background. You could find it in a kind of crass anti-intellectualism in some places. You could also find it in a kind of unhappy silence that some people within second-level education expressed in the 1960s. But with the onset of the Troubles in the very late 60s and the 1970s, this kind of distanced approach to Ireland's history that was based upon the acceptance of partition became harder and harder to sustain.
So who won these wars then between the revisionists on the one hand?
Right. Well, of course, revision is a great term because it's the kind of term of abuse you can apply to anyone you don't like, as it were.
Until the revisionists took it on as a badge of honour.
Yeah,
then.
well, they tended to do that rather too early, as it were. I mean, in part, that generation of historians I was speaking of were so sure of their good faith. And indeed, it seems to me they had genuine good faith. That when somebody said, you're revisionist, they said innocently, well, yeah, but isn't everybody a revisionist? We are all revisionists now, said Roy Foster. Not claiming to be part of some grand ideological crusade, but simply saying, isn't that the job of historians, to provide this kind of revision? But by the middle of the 1970s, saying that could be easily interpreted, and was readily interpreted, as a way of saying we take one particular position in regard to partition. And that's how it happened. And so revisionism, which in terms, and you know, Patrick, in terms of the English Civil War, which is regarded as just another phase, revisionism in terms of the American Civil War, which is regarded as an interpretative school, became in Ireland more than an interpretative school, as an imposed ideological position. And lots of people who were called revisionists said, well, that doesn't apply to me at all. But because they had innocently been willing to accept we are all revisionists now, it could easily be meant to say that we are all, as it were, subversives now, or we're all part of a cultural elite now. And therefore, the charge of revisionism became a potent one in the desire of people outside the academy, but very interestingly as well, younger people within the academy, to launch a challenge against their elders. So in a sense, what you're seeing to some extent is a sort of fascinating Freudian attack of the youngers on the fathers here, of sons and fathers, or daughters and mothers, in competition to each other, on the basis that you have resigned, you've resigned from the responsibility of commenting on the catastrophic nature of Irish history and the violence that is in Irish history all along, and the moral responsibility for that violence, which must be addressed somewhere.
Professor Ciaran Brady, thank you for joining us today and for, I suppose, bringing these debates about the writing of Irish history to life. Thank you so much.